Hey guys, tonight we're going to walk well limp really into the decaying twilight of one of history's most unforgettable monarchs. But don't worry, we're starting when things still smell nice. You're in Tudor England, and the air is laced with rosewater mulled wine and just a hint of divine right. You stand among silks and lute music, and there he is, your king. Stepping out like he's been painted by angels. Tall, broad-shouldered, golden red hair catching the candlelight. That jawline could slice bread. He's 17, charming and terrifyingly full of potential. For now, the world bows before him, and honestly, so might you. But here's the thing, you probably won't survive this story. Not because it's dangerous, but because you'll wince yourself into unconsciousness long before the end. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're already snuggled in, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You first meet Henry Tudor, not as a bloated tyrant, but as the stuff of Renaissance dating profiles. Born June 28, 1491, he arrives in a gilded cradle, second son to King Henry VII, a king whose personality was mostly taxes and ulcers. But fortune, in a twist of morbid efficiency, clears the path to the throne when Henry's older brother Arthur dies young. Suddenly, the backup prince becomes England's golden hope, and he glows. Tall for his time, athletic, fluent in multiple languages, playing the lute and dancing like he has no idea about his future cholesterol levels. A Venetian ambassador gushes that he has an angelic face and is superior in beauty to any other Christian prince. It's unclear if the ambassador was paid for this quote, but let's roll with it. Henry is crowned king at just 17, and for a while he plays the part like he was born for it. Tournaments, hunts, poetic declarations, he even dabbles in theology. Think of him as the Renaissance version of a varsity quarterback who also runs debate club. But beneath the charm lies a mind already trained in power, already shaped by the tight control of his father. Henry VIII is not going to be the kind of king who asks for permission. Ever. In the early years of his reign, he has energy, charisma, and a growing hunger for legacy. He marries Catherine of Aragon, his late brother's widow, by the way, with a papal blessing and dreams of a male heir. But the babies don't stick. Or when they do, they don't last. Except for Mary. And for a man whose masculinity is practically a state project, that's not enough. Still, these early years sparkle. You ride alongside him as he hunts through misty forests, his horse thundering ahead of lesser nobles. You watch him preside over court with sharp wit, surrounded by music, wine, and admirers. He's not just a king. He's the king. A living god on horseback. And you'd better believe he believes it too. But as with all Renaissance highlight reels, the darker edges are easy to miss. There's an impatience in him, a volatility. When a servant spills wine or a noble's joke falls flat, his smile doesn't reach his eyes. There's a flash of something colder, more calculating, like a man who knows he's been chosen by divine right and assumes God never makes mistakes. One mainstream fact you can't skip: Henry's early reign was marked by an aggressive embrace of chivalry. He revived jousts, emphasized the warrior king persona, and leaned heavily on the Arthurian legends. He was obsessed with being remembered, not just as a ruler, but as an icon. But here's the thing, they don't always teach in school. Henry's early obsession with physical perfection, his own and others, wasn't just vanity, it was strategy. Kings back then had to look invincible. A limping, weak king meant rebellion. If your calf muscles showed weakness, your crown might too. Historians still argue whether this early image, so flawless, so adored, was Henry's true nature or a carefully polished facade. Was he ever really the golden boy? or was the rot already under the surface? Either way, it's intoxicating to be near him now. You stand by as he dines on venison, and pomegranate seeds, wipes his mouth with gold-threaded linen, and dismisses ambassadors with a flick of his fingers. He talks about glory, about empire, about being the father of a dynasty that will outlast Rome. And yet somewhere deep in his leg, perhaps during a joust, you barely noticed, there's already a bruise forming. Small, innocuous, the kind you'd forget by morning, but it will remember him. A final quirky tidbit before you sleep deeper into this nightmare. Henry VIII's court had an official groom of the stool. Yes, someone whose royal job was to assist the king with bowel movements. Power, it turns out, smells the same at every level. So here you are, basking in the glow of a golden monarch, unaware that the sun is already setting. His face still glistens with youth. His laugh still echoes down marble halls. But this is the last time you'll see him untouched, because in the next section, the horse falls, and so does the man. You don't hear the bones break. What reaches you first is the silence. That sharp, unnatural pause in the middle of what was supposed to be a grand spectacle, cheering nobles, blaring trumpets, the thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth. But in an instant, all of that vanishes. And in its place, a collective gasp. One so wide it seems to suck the warmth out of the air. You turn your head and see it, Henry, your king flat on the ground. His horse, a massive, war-trained beast, has fallen with him. But not just beside him, on top of him. 16 hands high, and weighing more than half a ton, the animal lands squarely on Henry's right side. And then there's nothing. No movement. No groan. Just a great unmoving hulk of a man crushed in full armor beneath an even greater hulk of panicked muscle and hooves. It's January 24th, 1536, the day everything begins to rot. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Henry had been jousting for decades. He loved it, no, craved it. The power, the pageantry, the opportunity to display his royal body to all of Europe like some gilded prize in plate armor. He wasn't just competing today, he was performing. And as far as he was concerned, this was his stage. But horses don't care about divine right. Neither do the laws of physics. He lies unconscious for 2 full hours. That's a long time to be without breath, without movement, without a pulse anyone can find. Some whisper that he died on the field and came back. Others say he never truly returned. When he does open his eyes, it's clear something's changed. Physically, the worst damage is to his leg, his right thigh crushed and torn. It will never truly heal. That much becomes obvious quickly, but something deeper breaks too. Something less visible, but far more lasting. The young, brilliant, golden man who once danced his way through court disappears that afternoon, buried beneath the weight of that horse. And what rises in his place is someone else. The ulcer starts as just a wound. A nasty one, yes, but manageable, or so they think. They clean it. They bind it. They tell themselves it will pass. But it doesn't. It worsens. Day by day, week by week. Until it's not just a medical issue, it's a royal crisis. Soon it seeps. Then it stinks. By spring, it's leaking pus, so foul you can smell the king before you see him. And no, that's not a metaphor. The odor becomes legend. Courtiers develop subtle tactics, perfume-dipped gloves held politely over noses, sudden turns toward open windows. But they never wince, never flinch. Because to show disgust is to risk death. And Henry, he notices everything. Historians still argue whether this was the moment his mental state began to unravel, or whether it simply revealed what had always been there. Some suggest the jousting fall caused a traumatic brain injury, the kind that alters mood and sharpens aggression. Others say it just gave him permission to stop pretending to be kind. But you don't need theories. You're there, watching it happen in real time. He starts speaking less in public, laughs less, eats more. He doesn't ride anymore, not really. He's carried, pulled, hoisted, first by men, then eventually by a mechanical pulley system built to lift his growing frame between rooms. You'd like to think he mourns his old self. But the truth is, he arms his new one. You're present for the slow remaking of a monarch, one who leans hard into rage now, who finds comfort in fear. The once shimmering prince becomes the tyrant of whispers. The ulcers never close. But neither do the prison gates, and the two bleed into each other. Want a mainstream fact? Just months after this accident, Henry has Anne Boleyn, his second wife, arrested and executed. The same woman for whom he broke from Rome restructured the nation's faith and turned Europe upside down. She's accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Historians still debate the evidence. Some argue it was entirely fabricated. Others claim her flirtations made her vulnerable in the hands of a king whose patience had collapsed along with his leg. Either way, the message is clear. Mercy died on that tournament field. Behind closed doors, the leg wound festers. His physicians try everything: poultices, cauterizations, even treatments made with arsenic and mercury. The leg is packed and repacked with herbs, but the odor persists. Sometimes it leaks blood, sometimes yellow fluid, sometimes worse. One fringe tidbit: Henry reportedly refused to let any of his physicians see the leg alone. A rotating team had to be present at all times, just in case anyone got ideas. That's how deep the paranoia had already set in. He stops trusting people, and the people around him, they stop breathing easy. You find yourself studying his face constantly, reading micro-expressions, calculating risk. Because one wrong word could turn into an accusation, and one accusation can lead to the tower. There are still banquets, still festivals, but the joy has curdled. The court moves more carefully now, dances a little slower. Everyone is a little too polite. And Henry, he begins to eat. A lot. But that comes later. For now, all you know is that something terrible has begun, and no one dares give it a name. The fall should have killed him. And some days, you almost wish it had. Because what survives is something far more terrifying than death. A man in constant pain, clinging to power, like a lifeline watching his body betray him inch by inch, and making everyone around him pay for it. The ulcer doesn't go away. You hope it will. Everyone does. Because it would be so much easier if it were just a wound, just some stubborn infection that could be treated with enough herbs and prayer. But weeks become months, and then years, and still it festers. The smell, first faint, grows unbearable. There's no perfume that can mask it. No polite phrase that can explain it away. By now, you know what's coming every time he enters a room. The scent of rotting flesh always arrives first, sharp, sickly sweet, like something dead tucked behind the tapestries. You breathe through your mouth, bow low, and hold your expression steady. You've learned the art of flattery under duress. Everyone at court has. Henry knows, of course. He can't not. But no one speaks of it. Not out loud. To mention the smell or the leg or the wound is to flirt with exile. Or worse. So you pretend. You pretend that everything is fine while watching a king slowly rot from the inside out. The wound is in his right leg, and it never heals. It opens again and again, weeping fluid, attracting flies in summer, and never letting him rest in peace. His physicians call it a fistula or an ulceration. They probe it with metal instruments, apply poultices of crushed herbs and exotic minerals, and occasionally try cauterization, pressing red-hot irons directly against the flesh. It does not help. In fact, it often makes things worse. One day, you see a physician emerge from the king's chamber, pale as parchment, the front of his doublet stained with something yellow and foul. He doesn't say a word, just leaves the palace entirely and never comes back. You understand. And yet, Henry survives. That's the part that startles you most. The body is failing visibly, obviously, but it won't give up. It keeps going. And with it, so does the man inside. Only now he isn't walking. Not really. He's carried from room to room by attendants or transported via pulley in a massive customized chair. The corridors of Whitehall Palace are widened to accommodate him. Doorways are expanded, floors reinforced. He is quite literally reshaping the architecture of power with the weight of his body. It is not just the wound that changes him. It's the stillness. Henry had once been a man of motion, a hunter, a dancer, a jouster. Now that energy has nowhere to go but inward, it curdles, it festers. He becomes sharper, colder, quieter. And then sometimes he explodes. The courtiers call it the turn. 1 minute he's calm, grunting through the pain, nodding through reports. The next, his eyes flash, his voice booms, and someone is sent away, or arrested, or worse. You learn to avoid eye contact on those days. By now, the ulcer has consumed more than just his flesh. It has consumed his identity. And so, in defiance, Henry builds himself up in other ways. He eats, he drinks, he indulges. Kitchen records show that he consumes more than 5,000 calories a day. Red meats, rich pies, sugary custards. Entire boar's heads brought to his private table glazed with honey and surrounded by oranges. He rarely touches vegetables. Why would he? Vegetables are for monks and peasants. A typical dinner includes lamb, duck, goose venison, and fish all at once, washed down with copious amounts of wine and ale. Brewed strong and sweet to his liking. The result is inevitable. His waistline expands from a svelte 89 centimeters in youth to more than 130 centimeters. His weight balloons past some 180 kilograms. The man who once defined male beauty in Europe now needs help standing, and still the wound festers. There's something cruel about it, how one leg wound could topple an entire empire if it chose to. But it doesn't. Not yet. Instead, it becomes his constant companion, his shadow. The second throne he never leaves. A mainstream fact. Henry had dozens of royal physicians. Some were true experts in Renaissance medicine. Others were charlatans who promised miracle cures with mercury and powdered pearls. One even suggested regular bloodletting to balance the humors. That went about as well as you'd expect. He bled, weakened, and raged. But still, he refused to stop. Historians still debate whether Henry's refusal to amputate was stubborn pride or a fear of dying on the table. It's likely both. Losing the leg meant losing what was left of the illusion. It meant admitting defeat. And Henry Tudor does not admit defeat. There's a story quietly whispered that a maid once saw the king's wound unwrapped. She reportedly fainted on the spot. The skin had peeled back so far that his bone was visible. Through the blackened, weeping tissue. The smell, she said later, was like sulfur and spoiled meat. She was never seen at court again. But what do you do when the king is falling apart, and yet he still commands absolute obedience? You sit beside him. You serve. You bow. And you count every step backward as a blessing. Want a strange tidbit? The smell became so pervasive that entire rooms were designated scented chambers. Staff filled bowls with lavender and rosemary, and handkerchiefs were soaked in vinegar to help mask the odor. And still, it clung to everything, the drapes, the rugs, the skin of those who stood too close for too long. You begin to wonder, where does the man end and the infection begin? Henry still holds audiences, still signs laws, still executes nobles. but his radius grows smaller. The throne room is no longer a grand hall, it's wherever his chair is wheeled. His world is shrinking one painful inch at a time. And you sit very still. You do not comment on the bandages. You do not wince at the flies. You breathe shallowly, you bow deeply, and you try not to imagine what it must be like to be a man who once ruled the world through motion, now chained forever to a leg that oozes like a dying fruit. But deep down you know, the wound isn't just in his leg, it's everywhere now. The eating becomes ritual. At first it feels like denial. You tell yourself everyone does that, maybe it's a phase. That maybe he'll return to simpler foods when the pain recedes, when the ulcer heals, when the swelling goes down. But nothing recedes. Nothing heals. Nothing goes down. So instead everything grows. The tables at court are no longer just displays of royal opulence. They are defenses, distractions, mountains of food arranged like fortresses of denial, barricading the king from the smell beneath his robes and the stares across the room. Pies as big as shields, roasted stags in full regalia, platters of sugared fruits even in winter. And in the middle of it, all slouched in brocade, is Henry, eating as if the world still makes sense. You stand nearby holding a tray of bread that no one touches. The room is heavy with the warmth of roasting meat and the sticky haze of wine. Conversation, when it happens, is measured. Courtiers have learned if the king is chewing, let him chew. He's quieter that way, sometimes almost pleasant. But you know better than to trust the calm. The ulcer, now in its 4th year, has created a second man inside the king, one made of pain, pride, and suspicion. That man does not like to be reminded of limits. So when a young page suggests removing the crust from a pie because His Majesty seems uncomfortable cutting it, the king responds by having him whipped. Not killed, just enough to make a point. You learn the lesson: there is no kindness in calling attention to weakness. So you say nothing when Henry begins wearing looser robes, when his doublet needs new laces every few weeks, when his once-fitted armor is moved into storage because it no longer suits the tone of court. You just nod, bow, and keep moving. By now the court tailors have adopted a silent system. They don't measure him. They estimate. They add fabric. They subtract breath. They make it work. The king no longer mounts horses. He no longer climbs stairs. His world becomes smaller, then smaller again. You watch as ramps replace steps in his chambers, as furniture is rearranged to allow passage for chairs with reinforced wheels. And you wonder how much longer can a man expand before he bursts. One mainstream fact: by the time he turned 50, Henry was likely suffering from multiple chronic illnesses. Diabetes, hypertension, advanced gout, and possibly congestive heart failure. Combined with the wound, these conditions created a cycle of inflammation and immobility that medicine of the time had no way to reverse. And the medicine, oh, it's barbaric. Bloodletting is still common practice, as is the use of arsenic, citron, lead, and even mercury as cleansing agents. One physician insists on using ground coral in a paste. Another attempts leeches. When nothing helps, they move to hot iron, directly to the leg. You hear the screams from 3 corridors away. Some say the king cries during the treatments. Others say he just grits his teeth and mutters names people who have betrayed him, or might betray him, or looked at him oddly in a dream. And when it's over, he drinks deeply. Red wine, thick and dark as his moods. He no longer smiles. Not really. You remember a time when his laugh could shake chandeliers, when his voice carried joy. Now even his whispers are edged with suspicion. His leg continues to rot, but the king keeps eating, because in the absence of motion, appetite becomes the last thing he controls. Historians still argue whether his later physical decline was caused more by gluttony or disease. but it's likely both. He eats because he can, because hunger is simpler than pain, because taste still responds when his legs don't. It's one of the few pleasures that doesn't betray him, at least not immediately. Want a fringe tidbit? The court kitchens once tried to introduce a healthful course of lightly steamed greens into the royal menu. It lasted 3 days. On the 4th, the head cook was reassigned to a garrison in the north. No one ever brought up vegetables again. As you serve his meals, you begin to recognize the sounds of his breathing. It's no longer smooth. It rasps. At night, it wheezes like wind through broken shutters. You hear it from behind the curtains, from behind closed doors. Sometimes you wonder if he hears it too. He grows restless. Not with his body it gave up long ago, but with his mind. Rage flickers where boredom burns. And in those rare moments when his appetite dims, he turns to something else. Wives, not new ones yet, not quite, but memories, regrets, fantasies of being young again, strong again, wanted again. You overhear him once speaking low to his reflection, telling it that the court still envies him, that women still adore him, that his enemies still fear him. He says it so calmly you almost believe him. But you know what the maids whisper. You've heard what the laundresses scrape off the linens. The odor in the bedchamber is worse than anywhere else in the palace. And no matter how many scented sheets they use, the stench always wins. Still, he insists. You watch the preparations begin for another wedding. This one to a girl barely out of childhood. A way perhaps to reclaim something lost, or to pretend the decay isn't real. You want to look away, but you don't, because no matter how grotesque, no matter how far he's fallen, Henry is still the sun in your sky. And you orbit, whether you want to or not. The feasts continue. The leg worsens. The man inside slips further from the man he was. And somewhere beneath all the silks and sugars, the rot keeps spreading. The bride is 19. That alone wouldn't raise too many eyebrows in a royal court. Marriages are politics after all, and youth is often just part of the bargain. But when the bride is 19, and the groom is pushing 50 with a leg that leaks and a belly like a half-full wine barrel, well, even the walls start whispering. You watch as Catherine Howard, young and nervous, is led into the royal presence. She curtsies low, holding the pose longer than necessary, maybe to hide the look in her eyes, or maybe to avoid the smell. She's beautiful, no doubt. Playful, sweet-voiced, but not naive. Not really. And still she marries him. Henry calls her a rose without thorns. He believes this marriage will restore him, that her youth will pull him back from the decay. He starts wearing more vibrant colors, again, crimson, sapphire, gold, anything to distract from the weight, the stiffness, the wounds he can't hide anymore. He calls for music, dancing, banquets. He smiles more, laughs more, and pretends the ulcer isn't still weeping beneath his hose. But it is, and so is she. You can see it the way Catherine flinches when she has to sit beside him. How her eyes dart around the room, looking for any excuse to escape. She does her duty in public holds, his hand kisses his cheek, but behind the scenes, she seeks something else. Someone else. Enter Thomas Culpepper. Young, dashing, exactly what Henry once was and never will be again. Their affair begins in whispers in hallways under the veil of midnight. Some say it was love, others say it was desperation. But either way, it was dangerous. You see it unfold with the slow-motion dread of a tapestry unraveling. Notes passed, glances exchanged, a servant dismissed under mysterious circumstances, and then one day, a chambermaid talks too much, and the whispers reach the wrong ears. Henry is informed. You expect thunder. Instead, there's silence. Cold, heavy, terrifying silence. The kind that makes courtiers forget how to breathe. He doesn't rage, not immediately. He just sits very still, stares into the fire, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other clutching a goblet so tightly his knuckles go white. And then the orders begin. Catherine is arrested. Thomas, too. Interrogated. Tortured. There is no trial, not really. Just a process. A script. A sentence already written the moment Henry decided he felt humiliated. You watch as Catherine is led to the block dressed in black. Her voice shakes. She asks for mercy. She says she's sorry. She says she wants to die well. And then she does. Henry does not attend, but that night, he eats 2 full pheasants and laughs louder than he has in weeks. It's not love he mourns, it's pride. You might think this would mark a turning point, that after executing a wife barely old enough to vote in modern terms, something in him would break. But it doesn't. Or if it does, it breaks inward. Quietly. Corrosively. Because Catherine is not the first wife to die under his orders. She is the second. You remember Anne Boleyn, her wit, her sharp eyes, her head rolling on the scaffold. Historians still argue whether Henry ever truly loved any of his wives. But you know this, he needed them. Each one served a purpose, a political tool, a fertility experiment, a mirror for his fading beauty. And when they failed him, when he failed them, he simply replaced the reflection. And that pattern continues. His last wife, Catherine Parr, arrives like a nurse into a sick room. Educated, practical, more caretaker than companion. She tends to his wounds, reads him scripture, reminds him of Christian virtues, which is ironic considering her husband has executed more people than the plague. But Henry listens to her. Sometimes. She's the only one who outlives him, and that tells you everything you need to know. The marriage, like his body, is functional. No romance, no fire, just obligation and slow decay. You watch them sit together in the evenings, Catherine reading from a velvet-bound Bible while Henry soaks his leg in rosewater and wine. Sometimes he winces. Sometimes he sleeps, but never peacefully, because the ghosts have started visiting. He talks to them now. You hear the names in his sleep: Jane, Anne, Catherine. You hear him beg for forgiveness, curse betrayal, mumble prayers. It's not clear whether he's haunted by guilt or just bitter that they got away. One mainstream fact: Henry's reign included 6 wives, 2 of whom he had executed. 1 died in childbirth, 2 were divorced. Only Catherine Parr survived him. It's one of the most infamous marital resumes in world history, and yet in his mind, he was always the betrayed party, the victim, the king who gave too much. You try not to laugh, because it's not funny, it's terrifying. Want a fringe detail? Henry had portraits of his executed wives removed from court galleries. But one Anne Boleyn's kept reappearing. Some swore her eyes in the painting followed you. Others claimed it wept in the moonlight. You start avoiding that corridor. Catherine Howard's death doesn't slow him down. It doesn't soften him. If anything, it makes him more erratic. He issues new proclamations, has more advisors jailed. He accuses a servant of witchcraft for bringing lavender near his bedchamber. He orders a silver mirror removed because it lied about his face. You begin to notice how often people disappear. Friends, pages, ministers. There's no formal charge. They just vanish. You don't ask questions, because Henry is no longer ruling with logic. He's ruling with injury, with bitterness, with the kind of bruised pride that seeks revenge even when there's no crime. And through it all, the leg never stops leaking. The bandages need changing twice daily now. The stench has penetrated the palace walls. Even Catherine Parr can't mask it. She burns incense. She prays louder. But it's there. It's always there. You dream about it sometimes, the smell, the blood, the slow, wet ruin of a body collapsing under its own crown. And yet the king still smiles, still commands, still signs death warrants with the flourish of a man who believes himself untouchable. But deep down, something's shifting. You see it in the way he pauses mid-sentence, the way his hands shake, the way he looks at Catherine with a flicker of something like fear. Because even kings can sense when the end is near. Even kings can feel the curtain beginning to fall. The mind goes slowly. At first it's little things, forgetting names he once barked with authority, calling for servants who've been dead for years, pausing in the middle of sentences like he's misplaced a thought and doesn't know where to look for it. You tell yourself it's age, that all great men fade eventually, that the body's ruin must surely reach the mind at some point. But this is different. It's not fading, it's fracturing. Henry begins to suspect everyone. And no, not just idle court gossip or political rivals. We're talking about men who've served him loyally for decades, women who nursed his wounds, advisors who once shaped empires beside him. Anyone can be a traitor now. Anyone might be a poisoner. Even you, especially you. The royal kitchens, once the bustling heart of the palace, transform into something closer to a fortress. Every dish is inspected. Every goblet tasted first by a servant who must swallow and wait under the king's gaze before the food reaches his mouth. Utensils are scrubbed, boiled, then examined for residue. Spoons are tested with silver fingers, sniffed for oil wine casks uncorked in private rooms, while guards stand ready in case something explodes. You think I'm exaggerating. I'm not. One day, the king flies into a rage because the roast lamb tastes too clean. He declares it suspicious and has the chef confined. The man had done nothing wrong except perhaps remove a little too much of the fat. You try not to breathe too loudly. One mainstream fact, by his last decade, Henry VIII had implemented one of the most elaborate food security systems of any monarch in Europe. Servants known as tasters were rotated frequently to avoid bribery or corruption. Even his table salt was kept under lock and key. Historians still debate whether this paranoia was a product of physical decline or the result of minor strokes. Some argue that his circulatory system, ravaged by obesity and immobility, triggered vascular dementia. Others say the rot started far earlier and that power simply fed it. Either way, the result is the same: a king who sees betrayal in every corner. He doesn't sleep much anymore. Not in the way healthy men do. He catnaps, tosses, grunts, and curses into the bedclothes. Some nights he demands that attendants stay awake at his side just in case he stops breathing and needs to be shaken back to life. Other nights he claims to see Anne Boleyn in the shadows. Not the living version, the other one. Headless, silent, standing just beyond the candlelight. You no longer ask questions. You just fetch more candles. Want a curious detail. At one point, Henry insisted on having mirrors removed from his chambers. They lie, he said. They show a man I do not know. The attendants obliged, of course, but not before catching a final glimpse of the swollen face mottled with broken veins and skin yellowed like old parchment. The mirror may not have lied after all. Meanwhile, the ulcer is now 2 ulcers, one on each leg. The left began as a small abrasion, but soon mirrored its brother in color and scent. Physicians argue about which one smells worse. They don't say this aloud, of course, but you overhear things, and the treatment continues: poultices, lancing, herbal soaks. One doctor suggests honey, another leeches. A third suggests simply sealing both legs in pitch and hoping the flesh forgets how to rot. None of it works. The wounds ooze. The bandages bleed through. The palace reeks. But Henry still rules. He signs proclamations with a trembling hand, demands reports, interrogates council members over imagined plots. His voice booms less now, but when it does, it carries a new sharpness. A thin, crackling edge like dry branches snapping underfoot. He begins to talk about betrayal constantly. The word becomes his refrain. You count how many times he says it in one day, 11, then 13, then 17. It becomes part of the air. And then one afternoon, he orders the arrest of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, a nobleman, a poet, a distant relative, executed 9 days before the king himself dies. It sends a chill through court, not because Surrey was guilty, everyone knows he wasn't, but because it proves what many feared. Henry is no longer choosing targets. He's simply reacting. Lashing, swinging wildly in a room full of loyal subjects. The court becomes a place of shallow breaths and tight smiles. Even Catherine Parr keeps her distance. She's still dutiful, still attentive, but no longer sleeps in the same room. No one can stand the smell least of all the man producing it. You try to remember what he used to be. The young king who hunted through forests, whose laugh echoed across the tilt yard, who twirled courtiers at midnight dances and debated theology with the sharpness of a scholar. Now he mostly stares out windows, watches the trees bend, watches snow fall and melt before it touches the ground. You suspect he doesn't see what's there, only what's gone, a final fringe tidbit. Some said that during these final months, the king developed a fascination with mechanical clocks. He had them placed around the palace and often asked attendants to wind them again, even when they were still ticking. Perhaps it gave him a sense of control over time. Perhaps he hoped the sound would drown out something else. And yet the clock winds down, his voice fades, his hands shake. His breath whistles through swollen lungs. He no longer reads, no longer dictates letters. He just lies there, sinking into his own skin, sinking into the throne he cannot leave. You begin to count the days, not until his death, but since his last moment of clarity, since his last sharp command, since he last looked like a man who knew he was king. Because now he looks like a memory bloated, buried, still technically alive. The mind goes slowly, but it always goes. There is a certain moment when power becomes theater, when the man on the throne no longer rules but merely performs the motions of rule. That moment in Henry's story arrives without fanfare, just the quiet shuffling of slippers in a chamber that smells more like a sick room than a seat of empire. You're there when he tries to stand and cannot. You watch as he clutches the arm of the chair, then curses, then simply sags. The muscles won't respond. The legs can't support him. It takes 4 attendants to lift him, 2 more to balance him as he's lowered into his wheeled throne. The movement is slow, mechanical, undignified. And worst of all, he knows it. He tries to bark orders, but the voice is hollow now. Not because it lacks authority, everyone still jumps when he speaks, but because it lacks resonance. He no longer believes his words can shape the world. He says things like, "Let it be done," but his eyes betray something else. Doubt, fatigue. A king reciting his lines with no audience left to impress. The gangrene starts in the right leg, of course, where the ulcer has never truly healed, where the flesh is now necrotic, black at the edges, hard as wood in places, and soft as rot in others. You hear the whispers from the doctors. Amputation. Too late. He wouldn't survive it. They're right. The leg isn't the only thing dying now. His breath is a struggle. The chest rises, then stalls, then gasps again. Sometimes it sounds like he's swallowing gravel. His lips turn a strange blue-gray color. His fingers puff up like boiled sausages. The swelling doesn't stop. Neither does the infection. You see the fever return, sudden flushes of heat, sweat soaking into his pillows, then moments later shivers so violent he nearly falls from the bed. Blankets aren't enough. Fires roar in every hearth. The rooms grow stifling, but he keeps asking for more warmth, more furs, more layers, because the cold that's touching him now isn't from outside. It's coming from within. There's a phrase that circles through court now past, like a secret between the brave and the foolish. The king is dying. It's whispered, never said aloud. Not in front of anyone important. Because under English law, to predict the monarch's death is to commit treason. Even if he's lying there, unmoving eyes glazed, breath shallow. Even then you must pretend. So you say things like, His Majesty is resting, or the king will recover soon. And everyone nods, knowing they're lying, knowing it's a performance. But no one dares drop the curtain. Not yet. Want a mainstream fact? In the last months of his life, Henry suffered from what we now recognize as sepsis, a full-body infection brought on by the unhealed ulcers and festering tissue. It likely led to organ failure, delirium, and what some witnesses described as mad dreams. He would shout in the night, call for people who weren't there, cry out for Jane Seymour, the only wife he ever referred to as his true queen. You see it happen. One night, he wakes up and screams her name so loud it rattles the silver goblets. Then he begins to sob, clutching at the air, begging her not to leave. His attendants rush in, only to find him clawing at the sheets, eyes wide with terror, body slick with sweat. Later he doesn't remember, or pretends not to. The chapel is avoided now. Not by the priests, but by the king himself. Once Henry had fancied himself a kind of spiritual warrior, gods anointed the man who broke Rome and forged a new church. But now he won't even let the archbishop near him unless summoned, which he never is. Because if the priest is called, then something must be ending. And no one wants to admit what the smell already knows. You don't want to admit it either. But you're there. You see the decay. You smell it. You hear the strange, gurgling sounds that leak from the ulcerated legs every time the sheets are changed. The infection has eaten through so much tissue now that bone is exposed in places. It takes 4 attendants just to rotate his body each morning to avoid pressure sores. And still, the wounds multiply. Here's a fringe detail for you. The court now keeps baskets of herbs and orange peels in every corridor. Not for decoration, but to tamp down the stench. A few brave souls carry sachets of lavender pinned beneath their collars, pretending it's fashion. But nothing helps. The rot seeps through velvet, through brocade, through ceremonial armor and bed curtains and faith. And it's not just his body falling apart. It's his power. You start to notice who isn't visiting. Foreign ambassadors begin to delay their arrivals. Nobles send letters instead of coming in person. The court feels thinner, emptier. Like the last few dancers left at a grand ball that everyone else fled hours ago. And yet the rituals go on. You still hear the trumpets when he enters a room, even though he hasn't walked anywhere in weeks. You still see courtiers kneel and kiss the ring, though they do so quickly, eyes averted. You still hear the proclamations delivered in a faltering voice, signed with a trembling hand. But the performance is wearing thin. Historians still debate whether Henry was aware of how close he was to the end. Some say he knew and feared it deeply. Others argue he remained in denial until the last breath, convinced of his own divine immunity. But you saw it in his eyes. That flicker, that sliver of awareness. He didn't say it. He never would. But he knew. Because how could he not? His chamber reeks of lavender and death. His dreams are haunted. His skin is marbled with infection. And his courtiers now move like ghosts, drifting from duty to duty, waiting for a final word that never comes. The king still lives, but only technically. And you begin to wonder, is this what absolute power always looks like in the end? Not thunder, not glory, Just a throne, a festering wound, and silence so heavy it almost makes you miss the lies. You'd think that by now someone would say the word. That someone, anyone, would gather the courage to admit what's obvious to every nose, every eye, every trembling courtier in the palace. But no one does. Not even the doctors. Especially not the doctors. Because in Tudor England, saying the king is dying is not just bad manners. It's a crime. So when his lips turn gray and his chest rattles like wind in a broken pipe, they say His Majesty is tired. When the ulcers drip through 3 layers of linen and stain the mattress beneath him, they say the treatments are working slowly. And when he stops recognizing the faces of the men who have served him for decades, they say he is reflecting deeply. You don't dare say otherwise. None of you do. You stand there well-dressed, well-trained, holding a handkerchief soaked in rose water to your face and pretend this isn't a death watch. But it is. Each day now begins with a question no one wants to voice. Is he still breathing? And when the answer comes, yes, but barely, the rituals begin again. New herbs are packed into the cushions. More incense is burned. More prayers mumbled not for recovery, but for a quieter day. The moments of lucidity are fewer now and more fragile. 1 hour he demands his counsel. The next he slurs nonsense in Latin and asks for a son who's been gone for years. Edward is still alive, of course. But in Henry's fevered mind, the timeline is no longer linear. Sometimes he calls for Jane Seymour, sometimes for Anne, sometimes for his mother long dead. Sometimes he doesn't call for anyone at all, just stares at the ceiling lips moving without sound, as if bargaining with something only he can see. One mainstream fact, during his final winter from late 1546 to early 1547, Henry's physical condition deteriorated so severely that he could no longer leave his bed unaided. He suffered from recurring high fevers, likely caused by septicemia from the infected leg wounds, as well as congestive heart failure. Modern physicians believe he was dying of a total body breakdown, multiple systems shutting down one slow organ collapse at a time. But no one says that. Not even Catherine Parr. She's still here, by the way. Quiet, watchful, dutiful in a way that borders on holy. She reads to him when he can bear it, offers him small sips of warm broth when the pain allows. She listens when he mutters apologies to people long dead. She does not flinch when he curses her in the next breath. She too is pretending. And in this theater of denial, every detail matters. The handkerchiefs must be folded just so. The bandages must be changed at precise intervals. The windows opened an inch, then closed again. The candles lit and snuffed always in pairs, always in silence. The routine is the only thing holding the fear at bay. If you keep doing what you've always done, maybe the ending won't come. But you all know better. There's a moment late in January when the king tries to sit up and cannot, not even with help. His arms shake, his face goes pale, and for the first time truly and clearly he whispers, "I am finished." Then falls back into the pillows. The physicians hear it, so do you, but they pretend they didn't, want a fringe tidbit. During these final days, some courtiers began carrying hollowed pomanders, small metal balls filled with spices clutched tightly in their palms, or worn as pendants to block out the worst of the stench. The king's rooms, though soaked in costly fragrances, had grown unbearable. The smell of decomposition had become part of the air. You dream about it at night. The sweetness of lavender laced with the sourness of rot. It clings to your skin, your hair, your soul. And still the king breathes. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, is finally summoned. Quietly, carefully, no fanfare. Just a man climbing stairs with a Bible and a face full of gravity. It's January 27, 1547. Henry lies motionless, eyes closed, lips parted, the skin of his face drawn tight like old parchment. His breathing is shallow, uneven. When Cranmer leans close and asks if he dies in the Christian faith, the king cannot answer. He only squeezes the archbishop's hand. That's all. That's the last thing he ever does. The early hours of January 28th come without drama. No final speech, no prophetic vision, no thunder from the heavens. Just a long, shuddering breath. And then none. You stand there, frozen, listening to nothing. And yet, you do not say the words. Not yet, because even in death the law remains. To announce the king's passing without permission is treason. So the room is silent, his attendants still, the body still warm. You all wait for someone else to speak first. Eventually, someone nods. A physician wipes his brow and murmurs the phrase, "The king is with God." And only then do people begin to move. Here's the final absurdity: the real humiliation is yet to come. Because the king is dead, but his body isn't finished. Due to his enormous size, a custom coffin must be constructed, reinforced to hold not just his weight, but the fluids already gathering within. The embalming process, primitive by today's standards, involves removing the internal organs and stuffing the torso with herbs and cloth. It doesn't work. Or maybe it was already too late. Because after just a few days, the coffin begins to leak. The body resting in the chapel of Sion Abbey swells in the January cold. The gases build, the pressure grows. And then, one night, the lid of the coffin lifts slightly. A thin stream of fluid seeps out, trickles down the side, and pools onto the stone floor. A stray dog, yes, a real dog, wanders into the chapel and begins to lick it up. You are not hallucinating. This is recorded. Chroniclers of the time documented the incident with equal parts horror and fascination. The most powerful king England had ever known, whose word had shattered kingdoms, whose hands had signed death warrants with a flick of the wrist, now lay leaking onto a church floor, eaten by dogs. Historians still argue whether the story was embellished later by enemies to tarnish his image. Some believe it happened exactly as described. Others say the details were metaphorical, symbolic, not literal. But you were there. You smelled the truth. And when the funeral procession finally moves toward Windsor with banners raised and trumpets sounding, all you can think of is the puddle in the chapel. The pageantry continues. The state burial is full of gold and music. He is laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the wife who gave him the son he wanted. But no one mentions the leg, or the gangrene, or the dog. They call him Henry the Great. They speak of his triumphs, and you wonder, do they believe it? Or are they just afraid of being next? But there is no next. The king is dead, and all that remains is the smell. It's over, or at least it's supposed to be. The body has stopped breathing. The orders have stopped coming. The guards outside his door finally stand at ease. And yet somehow the palace feels even heavier now. Not with power, but with the weight of everything left behind. The rot lingers. The silence thickens. You walk the same corridors you've walked for years, and still it feels like you're trespassing in the house of something that hasn't quite let go. They seal the coffin again tighter this time. But you already know it won't hold. Not really. The embalmers have done their best with what tools they had: rough incisions, linen soaked in spirits, cavities packed with rosemary, cloves, sage. Still the gases build. Still the fluids rise. The skin, swollen and pale, resists the bindings. The stench, despite their prayers and powders, cannot be silenced. You've heard rumors that Henry gave instructions for his heart to be removed and buried separately, but no one can say whether that was done. His heart, if you're honest, had long ceased to function as anything but a weapon. It beat for politics, for pride, for power. Maybe that's why it burned out before the rest of him did. And yet the final humiliation comes not in the form of disease or execution or whispers, it comes in logistics. The problem, as always, is scale. Henry's body is too large for most things. Too large for the old ritual garments, too large for standard coffins, too large even for the funeral carts designed to carry kings. A new wooden box has to be crafted, reinforced with iron, then covered in black velvet. When they finally lift it, the men struggle beneath its weight. One slips. The end of the coffin dips suddenly. A thin line of dark fluid seeps out through a corner. You look away, but you hear it. You hear the drop hit the stone. And worse, you see the dog again. Not the same one as before, but similar. A stray lean and watchful, pacing the edge of the chapel as if summoned by scent. No one speaks. No one shoos it. Everyone pretends it isn't happening. But you remember what the chroniclers will later write. And the dogs lapped up the king. A scene that, whether literal or embellished, will haunt Henry's legacy more than any rebellion or scandal. The irony, he spent half his life trying to control how he would be remembered. Commissioned portraits that made him appear more virile than he was staged public ceremonies to mask private decay, silenced critics with the blade when the pen wouldn't suffice. And yet now in death, the truth seeps out through the velvet and settles into the stone. They delay the funeral, not for mourning, but for preparation. It takes 19 days before they're ready, and in that time the body continues its quiet betrayal. Attendants are instructed to apply fresh herbs daily. The chapel is aired constantly. Clergymen say prayers not just for the soul, but for the air. Some courtiers refuse to enter the room at all. A few feign illness. One openly vomits behind a column. The royal physicians, those who once promised they could cure him, avoid the coffin like it might bite. When the procession finally begins, it does so with full Tudor grandeur. The banners unfurl. The mourning clothes are spotless. The horses are brushed, their manes tied in ribbons. You walk alongside them, the wheels of the funeral cart creaking under the strain. The air is cold. Your breath forms little ghosts in front of you, and behind it all, the smell. Always the smell. Want a mainstream fact? Henry was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son, Edward VI. His long-awaited heir would rule for only 6 years before dying at 15. Mary, the daughter he once tried to disinherit, would take the throne next and burn hundreds of Protestants in her mission to undo his legacy. And then Elizabeth, daughter of the wife he beheaded, would rise and become the greatest monarch England ever knew. Historians still argue whether that was irony or justice, but you just remember the coffin. There's a pause before the interment. A final prayer. A pause in which you realize something unsettling. He really is gone. No more proclamations. No more dinners served beneath the gaze of a man who could smell like death and still command obedience. No more glances exchanged between servants with eyes that begged, "Please let today be a quiet day." He's gone, and yet not, because his legacy doesn't lie quietly in that tomb. It lives in the broken relationships between crown and church. In the marriages redefined, the monasteries dismantled, the laws rewritten. In the children left behind, who will each try to reshape the nation in their own fractured image of him. In the stories, the rumors, the rot. One fringe anecdote, some say that after Henry's burial, a single rose bloomed unexpectedly near his grave. Others say it was weeds, and others say it was nothing at all, that no flower would dare grow in soil that heavy with history. You return to the palace and find it quieter than it's ever been. Not in sound, but in presence. like a door has closed, like something enormous has exhaled and vanished. The throne room is cleaned, but the odor lingers, in drapes, in wood, in memory. No amount of lavender can scrub away what he left behind. The musicians play softer now. The servants speak in normal tones again. The air doesn't feel like it's holding its breath, but there's no joy in that. Only caution. Because everyone knows when kings die, the dangerous part begins. There are succession questions, alliances to realign, old promises to break. But before all that, there is a truth you carry, that others will only whisper about centuries later, that for all his grandeur, his battles, his reformation and destruction and reshaping of the world, Henry VIII died in a puddle of himself. Unmourned by some, feared, by most truly loved by perhaps none. And if there's any lesson to be taken from that, not the myth, not the majesty, but the man, it's this: even the loudest lives end in quiet. Even the greatest kings leave stains. It's strange how quickly the world moves on. One day, you're tiptoeing past the door of a dying king, and the next, the court is rearranging itself like furniture after a storm. New faces rise, old alliances crack. The air is lighter, yes, but that doesn't mean anyone is breathing easy. Because the throne is not empty. It never is. And whoever sits in it inherits everything: the glory, the burden, the ghosts. You stay long enough to see Edward crowned. A small boy, wide-eyed and solemn, wearing robes too big for his shoulders. The crown looks like it might slide right off. But the people cheer. The court bows. The illusion of stability begins anew. You remember Henry's face. Not the strong-jawed one from portraits, but the sagging, discolored version on the final day. You remember how he twitched in sleep, how he whispered names into the dark. You remember the wet sound of the wound being dressed, the rustling of gowns as courtiers hurried past, without making eye contact, the thud of the coffin lid when they nailed it shut. You carry all of it: the decay, the weight, the spectacle. The myth tries to overwrite the man almost immediately. Pamphlets circulate painting him as a visionary, a reformer, the king who severed England from Rome, who gave the nation its own church, who brought the crown closer to God. Others whisper a different story. The tyrant who murdered wives, drained the treasury, and ruled from a sickbed stinking of rotting flesh. The truth lives somewhere in between, and you unfortunately were there to smell it. One mainstream fact: Henry's break from the Catholic Church reshaped not just England, but the course of European history. The formation of the Anglican Church created centuries of religious conflict, redefined monarchy, and set into motion ideological shifts that still echo today. But the king who forced that change, he died believing his reforms were unfinished. He wanted a male dynasty, a clean line of sons to cement his place in eternity. What he got instead was a son who died young, a daughter who tried to undo him, and another who outshone him. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII was a genius or a monster, whether his actions were calculated or impulsive, whether the bloodshed was necessary or madness dressed up in ermine. Some call him a Renaissance visionary. Others call him a bloated despot. But none of them had to change his bandages. None of them had to breathe that air. You did, and if you close your eyes, you can still hear it, the scraping of metal against bone, the low moans in the dead of night, the priest's voice trembling as he offered last rites to a man who once believed he was second only to God. And maybe for a time he was, but even gods bleed, even gods rot. There's something about his ending that feels so profoundly human, not because it was tragic, not even because it was deserved, but because it was inevitable. All the power in the world couldn't stop what his body had decided. The ulcers didn't care about divine right. The infection didn't fear royal wrath. The breath still stops. The blood still cools. You think about that when the new courtiers arrive. Young, eager, unscarred. They speak of progress and prosperity, of rebuilding what was torn down, of correcting what was never quite right. And you want to believe them. You do. But you also know that under every throne is a stain someone tried to clean. Want a final fringe detail. Some say that Henry's last portrait, painted just months before his death, was altered by the artist to make him appear stronger, more regal, less near collapse. They say the shoulders were broadened, the face smoothed, the eyes sharpened to mimic his youth. In other words, a lie. But an expected one. Because the man who could no longer walk still needed to look like he could conquer. And now, centuries later, that's often the version people remember. Not the ulcers, not the stench, not the dog. Just the stern face, the massive frame, the hand resting on a sword. But you remember, because you were there when the crown didn't fit anymore. When the throne was just a chair with blood beneath it. When the king had to be lifted, shifted, bathed, soothed, and lied to over and over until the truth became too heavy to hide. The truth that nothing, not legacy, not portraiture, not even absolute power can stop a body from failing. Not even a king's. So maybe in the end, the story of Henry VIII isn't just about tyranny or reform. Maybe it's about the limits of control. The way we all pretend. The way even the most terrifying figure in Europe had to face what we all eventually do, the slow, quiet, irreversible undoing of flesh. And perhaps that's the lesson. That no matter how many wives you crown, no matter how many churches you build, or heads you sever, or banners you wave, the end comes. And when it does, it doesn't ask for your titles. It asks for your breath. And then it takes it. He died in velvet, surrounded by servants, within reach of golden crosses and stained glass and royal seals. But he died like any man, in pain, in fear, uncertain. And when it was over, the world kept spinning. It always does. And now, everything is quiet. You're no longer in a throne room or a chapel, or the corridors of a dying king's final days. You're somewhere softer now. Somewhere slower. The banners have been folded. The doors have been shut. The voices that once filled the palace have drifted into memory. There's no more fever. No more velvet. No more crown. Just a stone resting above a body that once believed itself immortal. And yet you're still here. Still breathing. Still listening. Which is in its own quiet way a kind of legacy too. Because stories like these are not just meant to haunt us, they're meant to remind us that greatness can decay. That power, no matter how absolute, must one day surrender. That no one, not kings, not queens, not even the architects of empires, can rewrite the body's final truth. So you breathe a little deeper now, slower, letting the weight of the past settle into your chest, not as fear, but as understanding. That even beneath the most towering myths is a heart that once struggled, a voice that once trembled, and a soul that, like yours, was never meant to last forever. The halls are empty now. The smell has gone. The page has turned, and somewhere in the silence left behind, the world continues on.